So every month a woman has something called a period. It can make us moody and cranky. Jokingly, you may not want to be around us because of our mood swings. But have you ever been more curious about what a period can mean for us and how are we viewed as a woman? Let's dive into the Bible to find out. The Bible does dive deep in the Old Testament on how a woman was viewed when she was on her period. It wasn't very good, but kind of insulting. This is what the Old Testament says in Leviticus 15:19 through 23. When a woman has her regular flow of blood, the impurity of her monthly period would last 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean till evening. Anything she lies on during her period will be unclean, and anything she sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. Anyone who touches anything she sits on will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening, whether it is the bed or anything she was sitting on. When anyone touches it, they will be unclean till evening. I don't know about you, but that sounds very degrading to us women. Anything I touch, I will make unclean. Like, you better stay away from me. I have no control over my body. It's something natural that happens every month that makes us moody and cranky. But that doesn't make us a bad person. We deserve respect. Now, the New Testament doesn't say much about our periods, but there is one instant that Jesus came into contact with an, quote, unclean woman. In Mark 5:24 through 34, it says, "A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and spent all she had. Yet, instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she had heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, 'If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed.' Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out of him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, 'Who touched my clothes?' 'You see the people crowding against you,' his disciples answered, 'and yet you can ask, "Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering.'" Just imagine how terrified this woman must have felt to be in public and in the Messiah's presence, and to touch his cloak out of all things. It must have been an act of desperation. We will get back to Jesus here in a second, but I want to focus on this woman. Now, this woman didn't have a regular monthly period. It was something more serious. She may have suffered from something called menorrhagia. It is a condition that can cause prolonged menstrual bleeding. This woman must have suffered a great deal physically and emotionally. I'm going to go back to Leviticus to finish reading what it said. Now, specifically, more geared towards this woman. In Leviticus 15:25 through 27, it says, "When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time other than her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has discharge, just as in the days of her period. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues will be unclean, as in her bed during her monthly period, and anything she sits on will be unclean as during her period. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening." Now, this woman would have been considered unclean until she stopped bleeding from her period. But that was not the case. She had a continuous period for 12 years. All of those years she was considered unclean to the people. They must have mocked her and ridiculed her, making her feel less than a person. It must have been awful for this woman. Now, let's turn our focus back to Jesus. How did Jesus feel about this woman? Did he feel disgusted by her like all these people? Or did he feel compassion and sympathy towards this woman? Now, let's look at the verse 31 in Mark. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out of him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Why do you think Jesus replied this way? Do you think he responded this way because he thought the woman made him unclean by touching his clothes? I think not. If you pay attention to the verse, it says he turned around because he felt power get released from him. He wanted to know who received his power. He wanted to acknowledge the person who had so much faith in him by just touching the edge of his cloak, that this person was instantly healed. This woman must have had a tremendous amount of faith to be instantly healed like that without Jesus even touching her with his hands. Jesus wanted to show this woman compassion amongst the people instead of allowing her to disappear in the crowd. He wanted her to feel love and be seen instead of isolated like she has been for most of her life. It was his way of showing her empathy instead of treating her like a nobody. Jesus told her to go in peace. Jesus wasn't like most men in biblical times. He showed the woman kindness and respect. He treated us like equals instead of something lesser. He showed us compassion and love. So if you are feeling dirty and somebody who is less than, remember, Jesus sees us and has the ability to cleanse us no matter how dirty we may feel. He wants us to live in peace.